people went to bed healthy. They woke up rotting, a fever. Then the swellings, purple and black, weeping blood and pus. Within hours, the screaming stopped. Then came the silence and the smell. Medieval Europe was the most connected and prosperous civilization since Rome. In 5 years, half of it was a graveyard. 200 million dead worldwide. This is not ancient history. This is the story of how the world ended and somehow began again. To understand how completely the Black Death shattered the world, you must first see the world it shattered. The early 14th century was not the dark and gloomy age of popular imagination. It was the apex of the High Middle Ages. Europe was booming. A warming period called the Medieval Warm Period had blessed the continent with generation after generation of abundant harvests. Fields that once barely fed a village now produced surplus. Surplus meant trade, trade meant cities, and cities meant people, more people than Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. In 2 centuries, the population of Europe had nearly doubled. Paris swelled to over 210,000 souls. Florence, Venice, London, Barcelona were not quaint medieval towns. They were roaring, chaotic, vibrant hives of human ambition. Gothic cathedrals erupted from the earth, their stone spires stabbing at heaven. A Florentine banker could finance a war in England. A Venetian merchant could order silk from China and have it in his warehouse within a season. That was the power of the Pax Mongolica. Under the vast unified Mongol Empire, the ancient Silk Roads had been pacified and made commercially explosive. Merchant caravans moved from China to the Black Sea to the Mediterranean with unprecedented speed. Ideas, spices, gold, disease, all of it moving. This interconnectedness was glorious. It was also the infrastructure of apocalypse. But cracks were already forming. By the 1330s, the warm weather that had sustained European prosperity began to shift. Harvests failed. Droughts scorched the fields one season, and floods drowned them the next. Malnourished and weakened, rural populations flooded the cities in search of food and work. The cities received them with open arms and open gutters. The streets of Paris and London were winding labyrinths of close-set timber houses, their upper stories leaning over alleys so narrow that neighbors on opposite sides could reach out and touch hands. Open sewers ran down the center of every lane. Human and animal waste accumulated in every corner. The cities smelled of rot before the plague arrived. They were tinderboxes. They just needed a spark. The spark was lit thousands of miles to the east, in the vast windswept steppes of Central Asia, in the region of what is today Kyrgyzstan, or perhaps on the banks of the deep, ancient Lake Issyk-Kul. Deep in the grasslands, in the burrows of marmots and ground squirrels and black rats, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis had existed for millennia. In its natural state, it was a kind of ecological secret, deadly within its rodent reservoirs but rarely reaching humanity. Then the climate shifted. Drought devastated the grasslands. The rodents moved outward, following the edges of human settlements, carrying their fleas with them. And on those fleas lived Yersinia pestis, hungry, patient, and perfectly engineered for catastrophe. The oriental rat flea is an astonishing instrument of death. It can survive more than a month without a host, lying dormant on clothing, on fur, on the hair of a corpse. When it senses warmth, it leaps half a meter and bites directly into the bloodstream. In a plague-infected flea, the bacterium has multiplied inside its foregut, blocking it, starving the creature into frenzied, insatiable hunger. The flea bites again and again. With each bite, it regurgitates a stream of Yersinia pestis directly into the blood of its host. Once inside a human body, the bacterium is ruthless. It evades the immune system with terrifying efficiency, spreading from lymph node to lymph node, multiplying at a ferocious rate. The lymph nodes swell, harden, grow to the size of a chicken egg, purple and black, burning to the touch, agonizing. These were the buboes, swellings in the groin, the armpit, the neck, that gave the Bubonic Plague its name. The bubonic form killed approximately 60% of those it infected. The pneumonic form was different. Once Yersinia pestis reached the lungs, victims began coughing up blood almost immediately. It traveled through the air. In winter, when people crowded together indoors, it spread like wildfire. Mortality rate, 95 to 100%. Average time from first symptom to death, 3 days. And then the septicemic form. When the bacterial count in the bloodstream reached critical mass, the body went into massive systemic shock. No one recovered. Not a single documented survivor. Time from feeling ill to death, 14.5 hours. A person could kiss their family goodnight, seemingly fine, and be found dead before dawn. The geographical pivot point of this catastrophe was a city most people have never heard of, Caffa on the Crimean Peninsula, jutting into the northern Black Sea. Caffa was not just a city, it was a powerhouse. Originally, a primitive fishing village, it had been seized and transformed by the Republic of Genoa in 1266 into one of the most strategically vital trading posts in the known world. By 1340, Caffa held a population of 80,000 people. Its harbor sheltered nearly 200 ships at any time. The Silk Roads ran just to its north. From her warm water port, ships came and went from Constantinople, the Levant, Italy, and as far as Iberia. Caffa was the hinge between east and west, and the Mongol Golden Horde resented it. The resentment had been building for 2 decades. Then, in 1343, a brawl on a market street in the nearby trading city of Tana turned fatal. A Muslim died at the hands of an Italian. The Mongol Khan Jani Beg arrived with an impressive Tatar army. The Genoese responded to his terms of surrender with breathtaking insolence. Tana fell. The survivors fled to Caffa, with the Tatar army thundering behind. Caffa's walls were formidable. The siege settled in. Months passed. Years. Then in 1346, something crept into the Tatar camp on the backs of fleas. Soldiers began to die. Dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Their bodies blackened with hemorrhaging. The camp became a charnel house. Putrid, swollen corpses stacked like cordwood as far as the eye could see. But what motivated the survivors to act was not the sight. It was the smell. The Khan, disgusted and desperate, ordered the corpses loaded onto trebuchets and catapulted over the walls of Caffa. These were not fresh bodies. They were well into decomposition. As the body rots, gases build within every cavity. When launched with sufficient velocity against a stone wall, they did not simply fall. Some exploded. Aerosolized fragments, blood and tissue teeming with Yersinia pestis, showered the streets, the rooftops, the market squares, the people below. This went on for weeks. The city was inundated with remains. Black rats followed the scent of the corpses from the Tatar camp into the city. Their fleas moved with them, and with the fleas came the plague. The Genoese, who had watched with righteous satisfaction as God struck down the heathen army, now watched their own neighbors begin to die. By April 1347, the Tatar army had effectively ceased to exist. Inside Caffa, the streets were filled with feral animals feeding on human remains. Burning buildings spewed jets of flame into the Crimean sky. Every public square held piles of bodies. In every eye, a look of wild panic or dull absolute resignation. At the harbor, the only means of escape, scenes were even more hellish. surging crowds and sword-wielding guards, children wailing for dead or lost parents, everyone pushing and screaming toward the ships. And beyond the chaos, on the departing galleys, prayerful passengers clinging to one another under great white sheets of unfurling sail, not knowing that below deck in the dark, sultry holds, hundreds of plague-bearing rats were scratching themselves and sniffing at the cool sea air. Several Genoese galleys slipped out of the harbour. Their journey took them south through the Black Sea, through the narrow Bosphorus, past Constantinople. But Constantinople was not a way station. It was a catastrophe of its own. The plague disembarked there and killed an estimated 50 to 70% of the population. The court scholar, Demetrios Kydones, watched his city empty day by day, writing that men inhumanely shunned each other's company, that fathers would not bury their own sons. The ships sailed on, into the open Mediterranean. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys docked at Messina, Sicily. Most of the sailors were dead, their bodies rotting on open deck in the Mediterranean sun. Those still alive were delirious with fever, their bodies covered in oozing black boils. The stench reached the dock before the ships did. Port authorities ordered the ships expelled immediately. But it was too late. The black rats had already used the mooring ropes to slide ashore. They moved into grain stores, alleyways, homes. Their fleas moved with them. Within weeks, the social fabric of Messina dissolved. People fled to the countryside, bringing the plague with them. The same ships turned away from Messina, docked at Marseille, at Genoa, at Malta, at Tunis, at ports in Spain and Sardinia. Each stop seeded a new outbreak. Genoa itself was infected in late November 1347. Between 30 and 40% would die. Marseille, the great gateway to France, fared no better. From Marseille, the plague moved north toward Avignon, arriving in January 1348. Also in January 1348, Venice, population 120,000, felt the first wave. The Venetian response was aggressive and organized. The Great Council declared all incoming ships seized and searched. Those showing any sign of plague were set to the torch on a nearby island. Ships and crews were held in isolation for 40 days. 40 giorni. This is where our word quarantine was born. It was not enough. Despite near draconian measures, Venice lost an estimated 72,000 people, over 60% of its population. Municipal gondolas traversed the canals day and night, their crews chanting a grim summons, "Bring out your dead." Bodies were piled onto boats and rowed to burial locations. The canals of Venice became rivers of the dead. By spring 1348, the plague turned inland, following river barges and merchant carts along every route that connected the dense heart of medieval Europe. It did not merely kill people in the great cities, it killed the cities themselves as functioning organisms. Florence is the most documented case. The city of 100,000 had already been battered by floods, drought, famine, and financial collapse. Then in spring 1348, rising like a fever from the very stones of the streets, the buboes appeared. They seemed to arrive from nowhere, on everyone, all at once. Purple and black swellings in the armpit and groin, then bloody vomiting, then high fever, delirium, the stench of internal gangrene, then death in days, sometimes in hours. Entire families were wiped out in a week. Giovanni Boccaccio was there. He watched Florence die. He described corpses stacked in churchyards in great trenches, hundreds of bodies tier upon tier like cargo in a ship's hold, each layer covered with only a thin dusting of soil. Then the heavy spring rains came and washed the remains through the streets, where dogs, pigs, and rats fed upon them in plain sight. Florence lost approximately 50% of its population. 100,000 people, half of them gone in under a year. The social collapse was equally total. Fathers abandoned sons. Wives left dying husbands alone in their beds. Courts stopped operating. Bakeries stopped baking. The streets, once filled with the noise of carts and merchants, fell into a heavy oppressive silence, broken only by church bells, until the bell ringers died and the bells fell silent too. In Paris, population 210,000, the plague arrived in June 1348 and festered for over a year. By the time it moved on, more than half the city was silent and lifeless. The best medical minds in Europe assembled a compendium explaining the catastrophe. Their conclusion: a rare conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter at 1 in the afternoon on March 20th, 1345, had released noxious vapors from the earth, corrupting the air itself. This was not stupidity. This was the absolute limit of human knowledge pushed against an invisible enemy. There was no germ theory, no microscopy. Medicine rested on the four humours of Aristotle and Galen. Doctors bled patients already emptied by disease. They lanced the buboes, which only spread the infection faster. They advised people not to bathe, because bathing opened the pores to the corrupted air. Some physicians advised inhaling extremely foul air to counter the miasma, which led entire communities to push their faces into the local latrine. Drinking urine became a popular remedy. Ingesting crushed sapphires was recommended for the wealthy. Hot pokers were jabbed directly into the buboes. A concoction of herbs and human excrement was rubbed into lanced wounds. Every rational attempt to fight the disease fed it. The plague doctors who emerged during this period were among the most haunting figures of the era. They wore thick leather coverings, solid boots, heavy gloves, and the iconic bird-beaked mask stuffed with herbs and flowers to neutralize the stench. Glass eyepieces, later filled with red-tinted crystal. They moved through the dying cities like dark, inhuman angels. They were feared and reviled. They were also courageous beyond measure, studying the disease, recording its patterns, beginning to ask questions no one had thought to ask before. In the 14th century, the physical world and the spiritual world were not separate. They were the same world. An event of this magnitude could only be interpreted as one thing: direct divine punishment. God was angry. The church said so. The evidence was everywhere. The righteous died alongside the wicked. The pious died alongside the corrupt. No prayer, no fasting, no pilgrimage made any difference. People massed in cathedrals and prayed together in packed crowds, which only spread the pneumonic form of the plague faster among them. Out of this desperation rose the Flagellants. Beginning in late 1348, groups of men and women, sometimes 500 strong, marched in pilgrimage across Europe, whipping themselves in public acts of collective penance. The whips were leather, tipped with iron hooks and metal spikes. Twice a day in public squares, they stripped to the waist and flogged themselves until blood ran freely down their backs. The roads they walked were marked by blood and by the corpses of those who died mid-pilgrimage. When God did not respond, and the dying continued regardless, the psychological crisis deepened into something uglier. If God was not listening, perhaps the devil was working. A hideous conspiracy theory took root, that Jewish communities across Europe were poisoning the wells of Christendom. There was no evidence. Pope Clement VI himself issued a papal bull pointing out the obvious. Jews were dying of the plague in the same proportions as Christians. Casimir the Great of Poland offered sanctuary to Jewish refugees and forbade persecution. But the mob didn't want reason. It wanted blood. Fueled by centuries of institutionalized anti-Semitism and the desperate human need to impose narrative on chaos, pogroms erupted across Europe. In Strasbourg, half the Jewish population was stripped naked, marched into a cemetery, and burned alive. In Brandenburg, they were placed on giant iron grills and incinerated. In Mainz, in Cologne, in city after city, whole communities murdered for a crime no one committed, against a disease no one understood. The Black Death did not just release biological horror, it released the darkest recesses of the human psyche. 90% of medieval Europe's population lived not in cities, but in the countryside, in hamlets and villages whose names have since been lost to history. The plague followed them there too, carried by refugees, traveling merchants, soldiers and pilgrims. Thousands of small villages were erased entirely. Not abandoned, erased. The records describe eerie pastoral apocalypses, harvests rotting in the fields because all the farmers were dead, herds of sheep and cattle wandering aimlessly, dying of neglect or turning feral. Wolves, emboldened by the sudden absence of human activity, encroaching to the edges of the remaining settlements. The carefully managed medieval landscape began to unravel. Nature began quietly reclaiming what had been taken from it. Some of these lost villages would only be rediscovered in the 20th century through aerial photography, their foundations visible as ghostly shadows in the earth. The manorial system, the bedrock of medieval rural life, ground to a halt. There were no laborers. The land sat untilled. And the lords, for the first time in living memory, were powerless. By late summer 1348, a fisherman working the English Channel could look toward the French coast and see the plague flag flying from nearly every town along the shoreline. The cross-channel invasion was imminent. England in 1348 was prosperous and confident. King Edward III had just achieved a stunning military victory against France at the Battle of Crécy in 1346. English wool was in extraordinary demand across Europe. Trade was vigorous, complacency was total. The Black Death arrived simultaneously along the southern coast and from Bristol on the west. At Weymouth, at Southampton, at Portsmouth, multiple beachheads at once. A local monk described it as a cruel death that broke out all over town in just 2 days. In England, the death rate was staggering even by continental standards. Continental European cities averaged roughly 33% mortality. England averaged 55%. Some cities saw 80 to 90% of their population perish. Travelers on English roads moved through a nightmarish landscape of giant black smoke plumes rising from every direction as towns incinerated their dead because they had run out of ground to bury them. Ash rained down on the living. Fields went untended. Livestock died in the pastures with no one left to tend them. London was hit in 2 phases. First came the pneumonic form in autumn, as the cooling weather drove people indoors and together. Then came the bubonic form the following spring, as warming temperatures brought the fleas and rats back into lethal activity. More than half of London died. The plague pressed north. The Scots, still blissfully unaware that the disease respected no borders, assembled a large army in the summer of 1349, mocking what they called the foul death of England. Before they could march, the plague crossed the border and shattered them. In Iberia, King Alfonso XI of Castile was on the verge of taking Gibraltar, poised to bring down the last Muslim emirate in Spain. The plague destroyed his army. Alfonso himself died of it, the only reigning European monarch killed by the Black Death. The emirate of Granada was saved by a bacterium. It would survive another 150 years. The plague took to the sea. Ships were found adrift on the North Sea. Nothing aboard but ravaged corpses and the rats that had fed on them. Bergen in Norway was struck. The disease moved east into remote mountain communities. In one isolated village, so devastated that nearly everyone in it died. A rescue party arrived in 1350 to find a single survivor, a young girl named Ripa. Deprived of all human contact for nearly a year, she had regressed into something pre-linguistic. She hunted wild game. She had lost the ability to speak. By 1352, the plague reached the gates of Moscow, and then, slowly, like a tide going out, it retreated back toward the steppe from where it had come. By 1353, the first great wave was over. The fog lifted over a continent that looked physically more or less the same. The churches still stood. The roads still ran. What had changed was everything else. Between 75 and 200 million people died across Eurasia and North Africa. In Europe alone, somewhere between 30 and 60% of the population perished in under 5 years. The continent had lost what had taken 2 centuries to build. Some regions lost nearly everything. The immediate economic aftermath was chaos. Inflation erupted. Supply chains shattered. Industries that had required hundreds of workers simply ceased to function because the workers were dead. But then something extraordinary happened. For the first time in centuries, the peasant held power. The lord still owned the land, but land without labor is worthless. Suddenly there was a labor shortage, unlike anything the feudal world had ever conceived of. A serf who survived the Black Death could walk away from an unfavorable lord and find a dozen others desperate for his services. Wages rose, conditions improved. The rigid structures of serfdom cracked. In many places they broke entirely. Some historians mark this as the beginning of the end of serfdom. Others see it as the first trembling steps toward the Renaissance, toward humanism, toward the birth of the modern world. The psychological and cultural transformation was equally seismic. Art became consumed by death. The danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged as a dominant artistic motif across Europe. Skeletons leading kings and popes and merchants and peasants alike in equal procession toward the grave. Death, the great leveler. The plague had proven what the church had always preached, but never made viscerally undeniable: that life was radically and terrifyingly impermanent. A new breed of physicians began to question everything they had been taught. The old ideas had failed absolutely. The catastrophic uselessness of received wisdom created space for something new. Observation, empiricism, the direct study of the human body and its failures. The medical renaissance that would eventually produce germ theory, vaccination, and antibiotics began its long gestation in the charnel houses of plague Europe. The church too was transformed, diminished, challenged, humanized in the worst possible way. When priests died as readily as sinners, when prayer accomplished nothing, when the representative of God on earth sat between 2 roaring log fires to protect himself from the corrupted air, the absolute spiritual authority of the institution was quietly and permanently eroded. The Reformation that would rend Europe in 2 a century and a half later was in part a consequence of the plague. People who had watched God fail them were ready to question. There is a line that goes, "The veneer we call civilization is only skin deep." Our more barbaric tendencies lie just below the surface. It takes only a nudge, a stressor, a catastrophe to blow us back several centuries. The Black Death was not a nudge, it was a detonation, and yet civilization persisted. Not intact, nothing was intact, but it persisted. The network of society broke down in places entirely and then rebuilt itself. A new equilibrium was established, hard-won, brutal, soaked in blood and grief, but real. Europe emerged from the catastrophe like the sun after rain, renewed if not healed. The plague did not end in 1353. It returned in waves for the next 3 centuries. Each recurrence shook the recovery. Each wave carried new dead. The world that came out the other side was not the world that went in. It was more cynical, more questioning, less certain of God and of kings, less willing to accept the explanations of authority, when those explanations had so visibly and catastrophically failed. Consider this: the empty streets, the locked doors, the fear of the air itself, the collapse of supply chains, the flight from the cities, the search for a scapegoat, the desperate unscientific remedies, the deep suspicion of institutions, the overwhelming, disorienting silence where sound used to be. Does that sound like ancient history? Or does it sound like something else? The Black Death was a test of systems, of societies, of medicine, of faith, of the basic human capacity to care for one another when caring for one another could mean your own death. 200 million people died. The world broke. And then, in the ruins, something new was built. Not better, not cleaner, not more just, but new, forced by catastrophic necessity to change, from death to rebirth. It is the oldest human story, and it is not over.